using it all for their own political ends. To discuss this issue, I'm joined from Charlottesville, Virginia, by a skeptic, Christopher Horner, an attorney and the author of the book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Global Warming. And with me here in the studio is Dr. Derek Wall, the principal speaker of the UK Green Party. Welcome. Welcome to you both. Chris, if I could start with you. I mean, you believe that this climate change is, as I was just mentioning, is not man-made, but is natural.
Well, that's what the scientific literature suggests, and I think that we need to stop for a second and just remember that climate changes. It always has, it always will, but if you say that now, somehow you're a climate change denier. I will refer to the authority of Al Gore and his movie. If you pause the DVD, and I'm sure everyone out there owns it, you'll see that he shows climate operating in cycles. Whether they're randomly chaotic or not, we know that temperature goes up, temperature goes down. Temperature goes up before CO2 concentrations increase and goes down after before CO2 concentrations. In other words, the cause-effect relationship is reversed. Man doubtless has a role. We don't know what it is. It's why we in the U.S. spend $5 billion with a B dollars every year looking at climate-related issues. So obviously, even if you go to the UN, which has just walked back its projection of man's impact from 2.4 watts per square meter to 1.6, that's 1/13 of just the change in the sun's influence on the Earth, also according to the scientific literature, since the 1950s. So if man's projected influence, according to the UN, is 1/13 of just the change in the sun's activity over 50 years, then obviously man doesn't drive climate, but probably has an influence, no doubt.
But does not drive it in that sense. Right, well, let's turn to you. Turn to you next, Derek, which is to say, you do believe that we are to blame.
Yeah, along with Mrs. Thatcher, John McCain, Arnold Schwarzenegger, all those other anti-capitalists. Now, the science is always complex, and we've got lies, damn lies, and statistics. If somebody comes on and says, climate change scientists say the climate never changes, that's wrong. That's very, very misleading. We've got the highest concentration of CO2 for 600,000 years. We've got rising temperatures. There are complexities and feedback mechanisms, but the principle is we must insure against danger. I don't know which scientists this guy looks at. There's one journal in the world that the climate change deniers have, and that's held in 25 libraries. And there are thousands of scientists involved with the IPCC.
Yes, now that doesn't necessarily prove anything just on its own.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But that list
there...
But
he was talking about the scientific evidence. Very, very small number.
Very small number would support your point of view, Chris. That presumably does not persuade you that you're wrong.
Right, throwing a bunch of things out there and saying deniers and other pejoratives, that proves nothing, and most of the viewers know this. Saying that Baroness Thatcher believes this now ignores her writings. Go to Statecraft, you'll see that you're saying something demonstrably untrue. The UN does use over 2,000 scientists, but they were never asked if they agree with anything beyond the 1 to 1.5 pages they each write upon, which is why you have to wonder, people, why are they deceptive? Why do they say thousands of scientists agree with something they were never asked if they agree with? There is no list of catastrophist scientists. There is no list of alarmist scientists saying this is what we believe. You can talk about atmospheric concentrations, but the literature shows, Al Gore's movie even shows, June 2006 Science magazine that he used, shows that concentrations and temperatures have the opposite relationship that he wants you to believe. He doesn't say it because that would be brazen. He hints at it.
Okay, back to you then, Derek.
I'm confused by what you're saying, because are you actually saying that the greenhouse effect doesn't work? I thought we all understood that you have a greenhouse effect, and when carbon dioxide rises, that traps sun rays. Now, we know this feedback.
You don't understand the greenhouse effect.
For example,
you're discussing greenhouse warming.
Well, please don't interrupt me. I will be interested in a minute when you have your chance to see whether you agree with that or disagree with that basic principle. Now, we know there are feedback mechanisms. So in the past, human beings haven't generated lots of CO2, but when you've had other forces that have changed temperature, as all scientists believe, when temperatures rise, that also increases CO2, but CO2 reinforces. Now, it'd be interesting to know whether you believe that CO2 creates a greenhouse effect, or whether this principle, this metaphor of the greenhouse is wrong.
Over to you.
Of course, CO2 doesn't create the greenhouse effect. CO2 contributes to the greenhouse effect. You, unfortunately, are confusing the viewers between the greenhouse effect and greenhouse warming. I'm going to refer them to an authority which I still have not heard you do other than the UN report. The June 2006 Science magazine, from which Al Gore derives his charts, actually says that in the past, when the forcings that contribute to greenhouse warming were higher than they are now, it was cooler. In other words, it says the opposite of what you would like people to believe. CO2 does not, let's just agree to a very basic principle. CO2 does not drive temperature. History shows that the only possible way, the only window in history you can very cleverly use is the 1970s to today, and I could counter by saying cell phone use has also increased since the 70s. And of course, that would mean, if correlation meant causation, that cell phone use drives temperature, but it doesn't drive temperature. You can say from the 1970s. How about from the 1930s? Haven't greenhouse gases increased far, far more since the 1930s than the 1970s? And yet it's not warmer since the 1930s. It got cooler for 4 decades, leading to the same kind of people saying, I know the answer, man must be at fault. It's a lassitude argument. I can't prove it, but doesn't it make sense? Man must be at fault. We're driving the cooling through carbon dioxide. The science has settled down accordingly. No, it wasn't. And it's not now.
Now I must give you, Derek, a chance to respond to that.
Very confusing stuff. So nobody's saying there is one influence on climate change. People talk about feedback mechanisms, and the problem with the deniers is the fact there are feedback mechanisms, the fact there are complexities means that you deny the whole thing. And you seem to be denying the fact that there's a principle that if there's more CO2, that leads to higher temperatures. And all you can do is smirk. You know, we know there are other things going on. So if you have more sulfur particles, that pushes it the other way. We know that if you have carbon dioxide, more plants grow. That then creates effects which damp it down. We know, on the other hand, that as temperature rises, permafrost begins to melt. That releases methane. So you have very highly sophisticated scientific arguments, and you pick tiny holes in them, and you use that to deny. And what we're looking at is the same as when people denied in the 70s that there was a link between tobacco and cancer. And it was difficult to prove. Complex feedback. I've had friends who've died of lung cancer who didn't smoke.
You're not going to light up a fag after the show, but you are going to get into a car, aren't you?
Because of that
so you don't even believe what you're saying.
But he's going to get. You're going to get in a times.
So
but the point there. Are you going to change? Are you going to change your life, Chris, at all? Are you going to insulate your roof, or all those things that people talk about doing now, or you reject all that?
What I'm going to do is remind people that the UN acknowledges there are 12 forcings, and we don't understand, or we understand them little to not at all, 7 of the 12. Those are the feedbacks my colleague, or what's his name, is talking about, to use his language. You used the word deniers 5-6 times.
Yeah,
you don't need to get to name calling. You can just say feedbacks, mechanisms, they're complicated. You don't need to say the UN agrees with things they don't agree with. We can just agree that the argument is not supported by the literature. I do common sense things to save money, but recycling will not avert catastrophic man-made global warming. The curious thing is, of all the people who claim to believe this, no one has ever put forward anything, and I'm sure my colleague will acknowledge this, that under any scenario or set of assumptions, according to any champion, would have a detectable influence on the climate, not even the Kyoto Protocol. In other words, it's about obtaining long-standing policy objectives,
you're blaming things
not about changing the climate, because it doesn't impact the climate.
And at that point, we're unfortunately at the end of our time. Thank you both for joining us.
Glad you're not flying, Chris, though. That's good. That's positive. If even the deniers aren't flying, that's good.
Someday, yes, I hope you get over your name-calling, but maybe not.
I think it's all the other way.
Well, I think that they should return, don't you?
Watch the show.
I think they should
we'll
return
come back and talk
for
about
another session
on nuclear
which
power.
In fact, they're going
to
carry on right now. I'll say thanks to all my guests. Join me again in 7 days' time. Well done, everybody. Goodbye.
Clouds, as seen by Qatar Airways passengers, your 5-star airline.